She was surrounded by coyotes, until a wild Mustang covered in red dust and Apache symbols appeared. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Sonoran Desert as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and checked her GPS device for the third time in 10 minutes. The coordinates should have led her to the archaeological site, where her Apache cultural consultant, Thomas Bigay, was supposed to meet her. Instead, she found herself surrounded by nothing but saguaro cacti, their arms reaching toward the cloudless sky like ancient sentinels. Sarah had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Her doctoral thesis on pre-Columbian trade routes had brought her to the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona, where she hoped to document oral histories that might corroborate her research. The academic world had been skeptical. A young, Chinese-American woman studying Native American history wasn't exactly conventional. But Sarah's grandmother had always told her that understanding came not from books alone, but from walking in the footsteps of those who came before. The desert, heat pressed against her khaki field clothes as she pulled out her satellite phone. No signal. Of course. She'd been warned about dead zones, but Thomas had insisted this particular location held significance for his people. The red dust beneath her boots seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite explain. And the silence felt different here, not empty but full of waiting. "Thomas," she called out, her voice swallowed by the vastness. The only response came from a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, its cry echoing off the distant mountains. Sarah consulted her field notes, written in Thomas's careful handwriting. He'd grown up on the reservation, his grandfather one of the last to remember the old stories in their original form. When Sarah had approached the tribal council for permission to conduct her research, Thomas had been appointed as her guide and cultural interpreter. Their initial meetings had been formal, cautious. She understood the long history of exploitation by outsiders claiming to study native cultures. But something had shifted during their conversations in the tribal community center. Thomas had begun sharing stories his grandfather had told him, tales of ancient pathways and sacred sites that weren't marked on any map. His weathered hands would trace invisible routes on the table between them, as he explained how his ancestors had moved through this landscape for countless generations. "The desert teaches patience," he'd told her during their last meeting. And patience teaches truth. Now, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, Sarah wondered if she'd misunderstood something crucial. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the rocks in shades of amber and copper. She knew better than to wander off the established trail, but her academic instincts warred with growing concern. The desert was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. She decided to give Thomas another hour before retracing her steps to the main road. As she settled into the shade of a massive boulder, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Carved into the rock face, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were symbols, petroglyphs that seemed to match descriptions from her research. Her camera clicked rapidly as she documented the discovery, excitement overriding her unease. The eye symbols told a story, though she could only guess at their meaning. Figures that might represent people or spirits, animals that looked like horses or deer, and geometric patterns that could indicate water sources or directions. Thomas would know their significance if he ever showed up. As the shadows lengthened, Sarah began to feel truly alone. The desert that had seemed welcoming in the morning now felt watchful, as if invisible eyes were observing her every move. She checked her water supply, still plenty for the hike back, and tried to shake off the growing sensation that she was trespassing on something sacred. The first howl came just as the sun touched the horizon, long and mournful, echoing across the desert floor. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She'd heard that sound before, in nature documentaries and wildlife films, but never in person, never directed at her. Coyotes. The desert transformed as darkness approached. What had been a place of archaeological wonder now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and hidden threats. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she packed her camera equipment, the howling growing closer and more frequent. She counted at least 4 distinct voices in the chorus, maybe more. She'd read about coyote behavior during her preparation for the field work. They were intelligent, adaptable creatures that rarely attacked humans, but rarely wasn't the same as never, especially when they were protecting territory or competing for scarce resources during drought season. The reservation had experienced one of the driest summers on record. Sarah's practical training kicked in as she assessed her situation. The main trail lay roughly 2 miles northeast, but navigating in the dark would be treacherous. Floor was littered with hidden holes, loose rocks, and the occasional rattlesnake. Her flashlight had good batteries, but the beam would also make her visible to any predators in the area. The howling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt more threatening than the previous chorus. Sarah strained to listen, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the distance, she could hear the soft padding of feet moving through brush, the occasional click of claws on stone. "Okay, Sarah," she whispered to herself, falling back on the self-talk that had gotten her through countless stressful situations. "You're smart. You're prepared. You can handle this." She pulled out her emergency supplies, a small camping stove, protein bars, water purification tablets, and a lightweight emergency blanket. If she had to wait until dawn, she could survive the night. The temperature would drop dramatically. She'd need to stay warm and alert. As she set up her minimal camp against the boulder, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Golden eyes reflected her flashlight beam from about 30 yards away, then disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. They were already here. "Hey!" she called out, making her voice as loud and commanding as possible. "Get back! Go on!" The sound of her own voice gave her courage. She'd grown up in San Francisco, where confidence was survival. Street smarts weren't so different from desert smarts. You had to show strength even when you felt terrified. More eyes appeared, forming a loose circle around her position. Sarah counted at least 6 animals, their forms barely visible in the starlight. They moved with a fluid coordination that spoke of pack intelligence testing her defenses, looking for weakness. She grabbed her camping stove and a metal pot, banging them together to create noise. The coyotes flinched, but didn't retreat. Instead, they began to pace, their movements hypnotic and predatory. Sarah realized with growing horror that they weren't just curious, they were hunting. Her phone remained stubbornly without signal, and her GPS device could tell her where she was, but not how to get help. The emergency beacon in her pack would summon search and rescue, but response time in this remote area could be hours. She wasn't sure she had hours. One of the coyotes, larger than the others and clearly the pack leader, stepped into the edge of her light. Its coat was silver gray, with darker markings, and its eyes held an intelligence that made Sarah's skin crawl. This wasn't the random aggression of a rabid animal. This was calculated, patient stalking. "Thomas," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her but needing to voice her regret. "Where are you?" The pack leader took another step forward, its lips pulling back to reveal sharp teeth. Sarah grabbed a handful of small rocks, hurling them at the animal while shouting at the top of her lungs. The coyote dodged easily, almost seeming to laugh at her efforts. Time moved differently in the desert night. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah maintained her defensive position, keeping the fire burning, making noise, trying to appear larger and more dangerous than she felt. Her throat grew hoarse from shouting, and her arm ached from throwing rocks. The coyotes seemed content to wait, their patience infinite. They took turns testing her perimeter, darting in and out of the light. Never quite close enough for her to land a solid hit with her improvised weapons. It was psychological warfare, and they were winning. Sarah's water was running low, and exhaustion was setting in. She'd been operating on adrenaline for hours, but even that was beginning to fade. The desert cold was seeping through her clothes, making her movements sluggish. Just as she was considering activating her emergency beacon, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that were definitely not coyote paws. "Hello?" she called out, hope and fear warring in her voice. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped, and the silence stretched taut. Then, from the darkness beyond her small circle of light, came a voice she recognized. Dr. Chen. Stay exactly where you are, Thomas. But something in his tone warned her that her relief might be premature. Thomas, thank God. Sarah's voice cracked with relief and exhaustion. I've been surrounded for hours. They won't leave me alone. I can see that. Thomas's voice came from the darkness, calm and steady. But don't move yet. Something's happening here that's bigger than just hungry coyotes. Sarah strained to see him beyond the ring of golden eyes that still watched her with predatory interest. The pack leader's ears had pricked up at the sound of Thomas's voice, but the animal showed no signs of fear or retreat. My grandfather used to tell stories about nights like this, Thomas continued, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah listen despite her terror. When the desert calls to its own, and the old agreements need to be honored. What are you talking about? Sarah whispered, clutching her makeshift weapons tighter. Can you get me out of here or not? Not yet, but watch and listen. The coyotes had gone completely still, their attention no longer focused on Sarah but on something approaching from the east. She could hear it now, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match her heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing second. Thunder, but the sky was clear, stars brilliant in the unpolluted desert air. Hoofbeats, Thomas said quietly. Horse hoofbeats. Sarah's academic mind immediately protested. There were no wild horses in this part of the desert, and the nearest ranch was miles away. But the sound was unmistakable now, powerful and purposeful, coming straight toward them. The lead coyote threw back its head and howled, a sound different from the hunting calls Sarah had heard earlier. This was greeting, recognition perhaps, even reverence. The other pack members joined in, their voices creating a harmony that raised the hair on Sarah's arms. Then she saw it. The Mustang emerged from the darkness like something from a dream, its coat the deep red of desert clay. Darker, patches marking its flanks and legs, but it was the symbols that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat, painted designs that seemed to glow faintly in the starlight, covering the horse's shoulders and haunches in patterns she recognized from her research. Apache war paint. But this was no domesticated horse dressed up for a tourist show. This animal moved with the fluid power of something truly wild, its eyes reflecting intelligence and purpose that seemed almost human. Impossible, Sarah breathed. Nothing's impossible. The desert, Thomas replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. My grandfather painted those symbols on horses when he was young, before the cavalry came, before we were told to forget the old ways. The Mustang approached the circle of coyotes without fear, and to Sarah's amazement, the pack parted like water, their earlier aggression replaced by something approaching worship. The horse stepped into the light of Sarah's small fire, and she could see the symbols clearly now, spirals and lightning bolts, animal figures and geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story across the Mustang's flanks. The symbols, she whispered, fumbling for her camera. They're the same as the petroglyphs I found on the rock face. My grandfather's work, Thomas said, stepping into the light at last. He looked older than Sarah remembered, his weathered face creased with lines of worry and fatigue. He always said the desert would call them back when the time was right. The Mustang turned its attention to Sarah, and she found herself looking into eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. The horse's breath steamed in the cold desert air as it approached, moving with deliberate care, as if it understood her fear. I don't understand what's happening, Sarah said, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her senses. Some things can't be understood, Thomas replied. Only experienced. My grandfather spent his last years searching for this horse, following stories and dreams. He believed it carried the spirits of our ancestors, that it would return when our people needed guidance. The coyotes had formed a loose circle around them now, but their posture had changed completely. They were no longer hunting. They were guarding. The pack leader approached Thomas with something approaching deference, and Sarah watched in amazement as the old Apache man reached out to touch the animal's head. The desert has been trying to tell us something, Thomas continued. The drought, the strange weather patterns, the changes in animal behavior. My grandfather always said the land would speak to those who knew how to listen. Sarah's academic skepticism warred with the reality unfolding before her eyes. The Mustang stepped closer, its painted flanks rippling with muscle and mystery. When it lowered its head toward her, she could smell the desert on its coat, sage and dust and something indefinable that spoke of vast spaces and ancient freedoms. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm not Apache, I'm an outsider." "Are you?" Thomas asked. "You came here seeking truth, willing to walk in the footsteps of people you've never met, to honor stories that aren't your own. That makes you more Apache than blood ever could." The Mustang's nose touched her hand, gentle as silk, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had held her captive for hours began to dissolve, replaced by something she couldn't name. Wonder, perhaps, or recognition. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Now we listen to what the desert wants to tell us, and we follow where the Mustang leads." The Mustang moved away from the fire with fluid grace, its painted symbols seeming to shimmer in the starlight. Sarah found herself drawn to follow, her earlier terror replaced by a compulsion she couldn't explain. Thomas walked beside her, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, completely at ease in the desert darkness. "My grandfather used to say that some horses are born with the memory of their ancestors," Thomas said quietly as they walked. "This one remembers when our people rode free across this land, when the symbols on its coat meant something to everyone who saw them." The coyotes had dispersed, but Sarah could sense their presence in the darkness around them. Not threatening now, but protective, like an honor guard. The pack leader trotted alongside the Mustang, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested long familiarity. "How is this possible?" Sarah asked, her scientific mind still struggling to process what she was experiencing. "Horses like this don't just exist in the wild. The symbols, the timing, the way the coyotes reacted. It's like something out of a legend." "Maybe it is," Thomas replied. "Maybe legends are just truths that people have forgotten how to see." They walked for what felt like hours, though Sarah's watch showed only 30 minutes had passed. The Mustang led them along paths that seemed to exist only in the moment, rocky trails that appeared under their feet and vanished behind them. In the desert, landscape changed around them, becoming more rugged, more ancient, as if they were walking backward through time. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, but Thomas only smiled. The answer came when they crested a small ridge and saw the valley below. Hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation was a sight that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Ruins. Not the tourist-friendly reconstructions she'd seen in other parts of the Southwest, but genuine archaeological remains, untouched and sacred. "Grandfather's secret," Thomas said softly. "He brought me here once when I was young, made me promise never to tell the authorities. He said some places needed to be protected from protection." The Mustang descended into the valley with sure steps, and Sarah could see why Thomas's grandfather had wanted to keep this place hidden. The ruins were extensive. Stone foundations, fire pits, what looked like ceremonial circles. But more than that, the entire valley seemed to pulse with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. "This is what you were looking for," Thomas continued. "The proof that the trade routes you've been studying existed. But not just trade routes, spiritual pathways, connections between tribes that went deeper than commerce." Sarah pulled out her camera, then stopped. "Should I be documenting this?" "That's up to you," Thomas said. "But remember that some knowledge comes with responsibility." The Mustang had stopped in the center of the valley, near what appeared to be a large ceremonial circle. The painted symbols on its coat seemed brighter here, as if responding to the sacred nature of the place. The horse began to move in a pattern around the circle, its hooves striking the earth in a rhythm that seemed to awaken something in the stone beneath. "The symbols," Sarah whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "They're not just decoration, they're a map." Thomas nodded. "My grandfather spent years learning to read them. Each symbol represents a place, a story, a connection. The Mustang carries the memory of the old paths, the spiritual highways that connected our people across vast distances. As the horse continued its circular dance, other sounds began to emerge from the valley. Whispers of wind through stone, the distant call of night birds, the subtle shift of sand and pebble. But underneath it all, Sarah could swear she heard something else. Voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The ancestors, Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts. They've been waiting for someone to remember, to carry their stories forward. Sarah felt tears she hadn't expected running down her cheeks. Her academic research had led her here in search of historical evidence, but what she'd found was something far more profound. This wasn't just about trade routes or cultural exchange. It was about the spiritual connection between people and place, the way stories and memories could be carried forward across generations. My grandmother used to tell me that understanding came from walking in the footsteps of those who came before, she said. I thought she meant metaphorically. Maybe she did, Thomas replied. But sometimes metaphors become real when you're ready to see them. The Mustang completed its circuit and approached Sarah again, this time with a clear invitation in its posture. The painted symbols on its coat seemed to tell the story of a journey, spirits traveling between worlds, messages carried across impossible distances, the eternal connection between past and future. It wants me to ride, Sarah said, hardly believing the words as they left her mouth. The desert has been calling you since you first set foot on the reservation, Thomas said. You've been listening with your mind, but now you need to listen with your heart. Sarah approached the Mustang slowly, her hand extended. When she touched its neck, she felt the warmth of its body, the strength of its muscles, the steady rhythm of its heartbeat. This was no vision or dream. This was as real as the desert ground beneath her feet. I don't know how to ride, she admitted. Thomas smiled. The Mustang knows, trust it and it will carry you where you need to go. As Sarah prepared to mount the painted horse, she felt the weight of generations settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a graduate student pursuing a thesis. She was becoming a bridge between worlds, a keeper of stories that deserved to be preserved and honored. The Coyotes had gathered at the edge of the ceremonial circle, their eyes reflecting the starlight like ancient witnesses. The desert stretched endlessly around them, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Mustang's back was warm beneath Sarah as she settled into position, her hands tangled in its mane. She had expected the painted symbols to feel like ordinary pigment, but they seemed to pulse with life under her fingers, as if the horse's very essence had been transformed by the sacred markings. Remember, Thomas called from the ground, this isn't about controlling the horse, it's about joining the journey. The Mustang began to move, not with the jarring gait Sarah had feared, but with a smooth, flowing motion that seemed to carry her beyond the physical realm. As they ascended from the hidden valley, the desert spread out below them like a vast ocean of moonlit silver, and Sarah could see patterns in the landscape that had been invisible from ground level. Lines of energy seemed to connect distant points, ancient settlements, water sources, sacred sites that formed a network across the southwest. The trade routes she'd been studying weren't just paths for goods and people, but spiritual highways that connected the hearts and minds of diverse tribes across impossible distances. Do you see it now? Thomas's voice came from beside her, though she could have sworn he was still standing in the valley below. When she turned, she saw him mounted on a horse of his own, a gray mare with wise eyes and traditional Apache tack. How did you? Sarah began, then stopped. In this place, at this moment, ordinary questions seemed irrelevant. The desert teaches us that time isn't linear, Thomas explained. Past and future exist together in the present moment. My grandfather is here with us now, just as our descendants will be when they need guidance. They rode together across the desert, the painted Mustang setting a pace that defied the rocky terrain. Sarah had never experienced anything like it. The sensation of flying while remaining grounded, of moving through space and time simultaneously. The symbols on her mount's coat seemed to tell new stories with each step, revealing layers of meaning that her academic training had never prepared her to understand. "This is what you came here to find," Thomas said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the reservation. Below them, the lights of the tribal community center glowed like stars against the darkness. Not just evidence of ancient trade routes, but proof that the connections between people transcend time and space. Sarah nodded, understanding flooding through her. Her research had been focused on the material aspects of cultural exchange, pottery styles, trade goods, archaeological evidence. But the real story was about the spiritual and emotional connections that had bound diverse peoples together across vast distances. "How do I write about this?" she asked. "How do I explain what I've experienced without sounding like I've lost my mind?" Thomas smiled. "The same way my grandfather told his stories, with respect, with humility, and with the understanding that some truths are too big for words alone." The Mustang began to descend toward the valley, its hooves finding paths that existed only in the moment. As they approached the community center, Sarah could see figures waiting for them, elders from the tribal council, young people with cameras and notebooks, families who had heard the stories and came to witness their return to life. "They've been waiting," Thomas explained. "Word travels fast on the reservation, especially when the old signs appear." As they reached the gathering, Sarah felt the Mustang's energy beginning to change. The painted symbols on its coat seemed to fade slightly, as if the magic that had brought them together was returning to its source. The horse remained magnificent, but it was becoming more naturally horse-like, less otherworldly. "The connection remains," Thomas assured her, sensing her concern. "The desert has accepted you as a keeper of the old stories. That responsibility doesn't end when the sun rises." Sarah dismounted carefully, her legs shaky from the extraordinary ride. The tribal elders approached with expressions of wonder and approval, their weathered faces reflecting the knowledge that something sacred had taken place. "Dr. Chen," one of the elders said, "you have been chosen to carry our stories forward. Will you honor that trust?" Sarah looked at the faces around her, Thomas with his gentle smile, the elders with their patient wisdom, the young people with their hungry eyes and open hearts. She thought of her grandmother's words about walking in the footsteps of those who came before, and realized that her journey was just beginning. "I will," she said simply. The Mustang nuzzled her shoulder once more, then turned and trotted back toward the desert, the Coyote pack materializing from the shadows to escort it home. As Sarah watched it disappear into the darkness, she felt a profound sense of completion and beginning, the end of her old understanding of the world, and the start of something far more meaningful. "Now the real work begins," Thomas said, joining her at the edge of the gathering. "The stories need to be told, the connections need to be preserved, and the next generation needs to understand what they've inherited." Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook with hands that no longer trembled. She had pages to fill, a thesis to rewrite, and a world to change. The desert had given her more than she'd come looking for. It had given her a purpose that would last a lifetime. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Sarah sat with the tribal elders and began to write. The story of the painted Mustang, the ancient trade routes, and the spiritual connections that bound all people together would find its way into academic journals and university classrooms. But more importantly, it would live on in the hearts of those who understood that some truths are too powerful to be contained by conventional wisdom. The desert had spoken, and Sarah Chen had learned to listen.